At the terror landscape in Africa tonight following that terror attack in Kenya. Kenya, a big target, and we have two of the biggest, most deadliest terror groups operating on this continent. Our guest tonight, Dr. Akinola Alojo from the Institute of Security Studies. We have Jasmine Opperman from Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium. And back on the line, it wasn't great earlier, but we have Daniel Heel from Control Risks in East Africa, Control Risks Global risk consultancy. Mr. Hill, could you lay it out for us? From reading the research that you guys have done, I get the sense that there's been a tapering off in North Africa, things moving down, maybe even closer to South Africa. Lay it out for us.
Thank you very much. Can I just confirm you can hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think, as I was stating previously, the situation and incident here in Nairobi, Kenya, hours ago, highlights the terrorism threat that is posed and exists here in East Africa, but also demonstrates, and as you state, could that be moving further south towards South Africa, really gives.
All right, that line, unfortunately, not better. We're going to have to leave it there with Mr. Heel. Let me come back to Dr. Alojo. So we're talking about the threat moving down. There were concerns at some point about Somali pirates moving down the coast. There's been an increase in attacks in Mozambique. How vulnerable are we in Sub Saharan Africa, in Southern Africa right now?
I think, let me start by saying that what is happening in northern Mozambique, precisely in Cabo Delgado, of course it's very worrying, and there is the potential for a spread of that trend. But I think we shouldn't get too carried away by the fact that it will just immediately spread down south or to South Africa. I think we need to be aware that there is a lot of research that still needs to be done in terms of understanding what exactly is going on there. There has been very little in terms of empirical data emerging from the incidents there. We've had media reports, and numerous ones, but then the real evidence-based research that can investigate the actors who are initiating or perpetrating the attacks, the nature of the financial connections, if there is any that links them with perhaps other groups on the continent. I think there's a lot that still needs to be uncovered when it comes to that.
Well, Doctor,
and this calls for research.
Let me stop you there. We've been talking about Boko Haram, we've been talking about Al Shabab. What do we know about the groups, possibly many operating in Mozambique? What do they want?
Okay, the group in Mozambique, according to the media reports and some of the investigations that have gone on there, reveal that there is a group calling itself the Al Sunna Wajamo, and in some cases we hear that it refers to itself as Shabaab, but it's not the same as the Al Shabab that we all know in Somalia. Now it's a different kind of entity that is there. Now the actual motives, even though of course there has been violence, beheadings and arson and various forms of attacks, even though that has happened, there is still a lot that needs to be established in terms of the group's motivations. A lot still needs to be understood in terms of the regional connections, if they exist, and also individuals or other entities that are connected with them. And we should be careful in the way we there's a lot of speculation going on, but at the same time one shouldn't just relax in South Africa or in other countries not far from Mozambique and just believe that okay, this is something happening there and then it can't spread. But we should be on on high alert and be aware, and also be continue with more investigation to understand it in entirety.
Ms. Opperman, do you agree we've been insulated thus far? Is the threat coming closer to South Africa?
I think I concur completely with the previous guest. The Al Sunna group and the Shabaab cells are not necessarily the same thing. There is no overarching extremist ideology linked to the Shabaab cells. There's no overarching leadership. and there's no claims to credit, and it's very difficult to pinpoint the exact reason and motivation. So to call it an Islamist insurgency is an assumption that is not based on fact. But I agree, we still need to do a lot of research and answer a lot of questions on the exact nature. Secondly, and I think this is the important factor, terrorism is not a virus that just spreads. Terrorism relies on context. So if we are going to talk about terrorism now coming down to Southern Africa, we are assuming that similar context as in Somalia, as in northeast Nigeria, as in Mali, as in Burkina Faso or Niger, or Mozambique exists, for instance, in South Africa. That's a fallacy. That is not the case. We need to understand the context in which these groups operate, how they exploit, how opportunistic they are in their barbaric nature of actions taken, and then ask from an analysis perspective, but do we have similar triggers? Do we have similar factors that could direct and facilitate terrorism broader than the area of manifestation? And this is my problem with many media reports. The Islamic State is finding feeding ground in Africa. And I'm thinking, Africa? We're talking geographically confined areas. Can we please be a bit more specific? And the same applies to Southern Africa. The moment we jump to that conclusion, we're playing right into the hands they want us to play. We are feeding their propaganda. Let's analyze the context of the existence and the opportunity. South Africa as a case does not present the ideal environment, for instance, for the Islamic State to find itself. That does not mean we should relax about a terrorist attack, because terrorism is opportunist in nature. But let's be realistic in our analysis.
There are claims that we're involved in the sense that there are cells operating here, training is happening here in South Africa. Is that true, Ms. Opperman?
I will believe that we have a terrorism training camp. And I'm talking Al Shabab specifically, many references to that. When I've seen the photos, when I've seen the training, and I see a video taking place. I have not seen that, and let me promise you, I've done a lot of research. I am sorry, before I haven't seen it, I don't believe it. Training itself is not the same as 5-10 years back. It can be an individual. It can be a group of people. It can be a cell sitting in a home, going on Telegram, downloading the propaganda material, how to build a suicide vest, how to build a bomb, and then do it and go and execute an attack. So training needs to be redefined in the media jihad we are confronted with as an international phenomenon. Hence, jumping to conclusions that there are vast areas of training taking place, I have seen no such evidence.
Dr. Olojo, your response to the claims that there is activity here in South Africa?
Indeed, I agree with the last speaker. I started with the point, earlier that we need evidence to be able to make conclusions, regarding some of these claims by the media and some other commentators. Now, what was mentioned earlier, I also agree in regard to having an understanding of the contextual factors. It's so important because the point about the risk factors, for instance, you might have poverty, for instance, in a particular context, deprivation, at very high absolute and relative levels. But then, the extent to which this can push individuals, needs to be understood in a larger context. If I take us a little bit, back to what we discussed about the West African context, for instance, the case of countries like Nigeria. There are parts of northern Nigeria where you have high levels of poverty, like in the northwest of Nigeria, and yet you do not find individuals, there's no mass movement or uprising of people joining terror groups or joining Boko Haram. So the context really matters. In the case of South Africa, of course, there might be the risk that levels of poverty and deprivation can compel people, but then there are other factors that need to be considered. The ideological component or dimension of this needs to be understood. The degree to which that can pull people to join a terror group has to be analyzed. But then again, what was mentioned about not ruling out the risk is also very important, and I would like to emphasize that we should not rule out the risk, especially when we look at the nature of the way terror groups operate in the present day period. The battle against, or the struggle against violent extremism today goes beyond the physical sense. We need to look at the online presence of these groups. There are cases of individuals who are on various social media platforms, who use cyberspaces, and who also support and sympathize with some of the terror groups like Al Shabab, like ISIS, and even other groups on the continent. Some of them may very well be in South Africa. And even the phenomenon of foreign fighters. I mean, there is a lot of reporting regarding individuals who left South Africa and other countries on the continent, who left the shores of Africa to join the ranks of ISIS in the camps of Syria and Iraq, a few years ago. And with the decline of ISIS so-called caliphate in recent times, there has been a return, a trend of people returning to various countries. By the end of 2017, the African Union, raised the alarm that, about 6,000, approximately individuals, are likely to return to the continent. And when they return to the continent, they will look for spaces where they can integrate themselves, or at least find a safe spot to sort of, facilitate some kind of growth. So while, of course, we are not rushing to conclusions in the case of South Africa, bearing in mind the risk factors, which exist or not, we should not rule out anything, because terrorism has various dimensions and it requires multiple levels of management to address it.
All right, so besides standing with our fellows on the African continent after that horrific attack, also we can't become complacent. That's a message from both of you. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. Akinola Alojo from the Institute of Security Studies and Jasmine Opperman from the Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium.